Welcome back, all you 8th grade U.S. history fans. I hope you had a great spring break. I hope you got outside. I hope you read some books. Hope you caught up on sleep. I know it wasn't going to be quite what you were expecting because of, this whole pandemic thing we're living in. But you know what? If you think about it, there's only a couple of weeks really left of school. Just a little over a month for you folks. So we are winding down to it, and we're going to do our best to get through this together and make up for. Okay, we're going to wrap up Thomas Jefferson today. Reminder that your test is going to be on Thursday. It's going to be proctored by the parent. A math test from Mrs. Deere. So make sure you start studying. We need to wrap up talking about Jefferson. Okay. Burr's out as his vice president, and Jefferson wins re-election in 1804. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about how terrible of a person Aaron Burr was, not just because he shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel, but he really was a very corrupt politician who was on trial for treason and a whole bunch of other things, and because he shot My name is Alexander Hamilton, he pretty much ruined his reputation. Alright, so Burr kills Hamilton. If you want more on that, I highly recommend you check out the acclaimed Broadway musical, Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, moving right along, that's not what we're talking about today. I'm getting sidetracked. Today, we are wrapping up Jefferson because no discussion on the presidency of Thomas Jefferson is complete unless you discuss Jefferson and slavery. Yes, Jefferson and slavery. Here's the long and short of it, folks. It is complicated. Jefferson and slavery, it's a very complex and complicated subject, and it's a perfect example of the paradox of Thomas Jefferson. He at both times is two things, all right? Which is basically a very enlightened man fighting for liberty and freedoms who often spoke out against slavery, who also owned and greatly profited from his slaves. So again, that's why we call it a paradox, all right? He sees two things at once that seem to contradict each other. Okay, I mean, just take a look at his house, for example. This is his mansion known as Monticello, which he completely designed 100% himself. Among the many things Jefferson was, he was also a wonderful architect. It's a beautiful house, as you can see. It is the most extravagant house and plantation of all the founding fathers, period. It's built on top of this mountain, all right? So I think Jefferson had some ego things he needed to work out, and it was very hard work, and many slaves died building this mansion literally on top of the hill for Jefferson. So while Jefferson's living here in Monticello, this is about what his slaves were living in who also lived on the property. That's an actual photograph from the property of Monticello. You can go and visit it today. So, enlightened guy hanging out in his house talking about how slavery is probably not that good, who is still owning slaves and having them live in extreme abject poverty. So let's dive into this today. Okay, Jefferson and slavery. As always, folks, a reminder to do your best to take notes during this. There will be questions at the end. There is a test on Jefferson coming up. The more you write down, the more you will remember, instead of just listening. Okay, let's dive into it. As you know, Jefferson owned many slaves, and he made a lot of money selling them over the course of his life. Owning and selling slaves could be a business in and of itself, even if Jefferson wasn't already a wealthy farmer. In fact, owning slaves and making money off of their labor allowed for Jefferson's lifestyle. It allowed for Jefferson's leisure to study the Enlightenment, leisure to study a lawyer, become a founding father, and accounted for his wealth and high gentry social status. That word gentry comes from the term gentleman. And little side note here, in colonial times, when they were still in the English Empire, the term gentleman was a legal status. Jefferson was part of the aristocracy. He was legally wealthy, and because he owned land, he was considered legally a gentleman or part of the gentry class, which means that he essentially had more rights than quote-unquote commoners. All right, so at this time, you're either a legal gentleman or you are a commoner. For example, John Adams was born a commoner, right? Didn't have a lot, but he worked his way up to essentially become a gentleman. But Jefferson was born into this lifestyle. His mother, especially, was insanely rich, owned plantations, owned slaves, and Jefferson was essentially born into extreme privilege, right? He would essentially have been in the top 1% of the 1%, one of the wealthiest families in all of Virginia, where he is from. And of course, Jefferson had time to go to college and study law and the Enlightenment and architecture and agriculture and do all these things. And he took advantage of his status, rest assured, whereas many rich people were content to just be rich. Jefferson thought it was the duty of the gentry class to go out and educate themselves because, well, they had time to do it because they didn't need to work for a living. So we must give Jefferson applause for that, for taking advantage of his status to become one of the most intelligent founding fathers, right? However, the only reason he's able to do any of that is because of the privilege he was born into, which mostly comes from the slaves, which he inherited and he used, all right? So we must keep that in mind. That slavery enabled Jefferson's lifestyle. And rest assured, this country is better off for Jefferson having become so educated. He's one of the principal founding fathers. He is our third president. However, we must acknowledge where Jefferson's leisure time comes from. And it comes from the fact that the dude owned other people doing the work for him. We need to talk about this woman over here. This is an artist's rendition of a woman who was a slave named Sally Hemings. Now, Jefferson had 6 children with this slave woman known as Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings was essentially his common law wife, as well as his legal sister-in-law, right? So let's unpack this. Thomas Jefferson's wife died when they were very, very young, and Thomas Jefferson's original wife, his white wife, basically made Jefferson promise when she was dying that he would never remarry. Jefferson kept that promise, but he essentially, rather than marrying, essentially just had an ongoing romantic and intimate relationship with Sally Hemings, who was essentially his common law wife, right? As well as his sister-in-law, because here's the thing, Jefferson inherited Sally Hemings from his ex-wife. Sally Hemings belonged to Thomas Jefferson's ex-wife's father. Sally Hemings was also the daughter of Thomas Jefferson's ex-wife's father. Therefore, Sally Hemings, Jefferson's common law wife, was technically also his sister-in-law. This is a very common practice at this time in the South during the colonies and during the early American time. Rich men would have intimate relationships with their slaves and produce offspring. It's not unusual. It happened all the time. Jefferson is no different. And this is just the example of that. Having 6 children, not all of those children lived, I should say. They didn't all make it to adulthood. In fact, in Jefferson's first marriage, only 2 out of the 4 children survived. All right, it's pretty common that it was very hard to have a child survive through childbirth, and women survived through childbirth at this time. In fact, that's one of the ways Jefferson's original wife died, was complications due to childbirth. Now, he had 6 children with this slave woman known as Sally Hemings. Now, the deal was, with Jefferson, he promised Sally that, listen, I want you to be with me, but but Sally Hemings was like, well, what about any children that we're possibly going to have? She didn't want them to be slaves. So the deal that Jefferson made was, which might not sound that great now, but at the time was radical, all the children that Thomas Jefferson would have with Sally would be free at age 21. So they would grow up to be slaves, but at age 21, they would get their freedom. It should be also noted, though, that Jefferson really ignored these children he had with Sally Hemings, who were technically Jefferson's children, but grew up and raised as slaves. He did not give them special privilege. He really ignored them. No birthday presents, no Christmas presents. To him, they were just slaves. They were the daughter of Sally. He did not consider them his own children. He treated them much different than his white children. In fact, he didn't treat them like his kids at all. The only real acknowledgement was that he freed them when they were age 21, I should say. So, it's very uncomfortable to talk about. It really is, because Thomas Jefferson is, of course, this very revered figure in American history who did a lot of wonderful things for us, but we must look at the honest truth about his relationships with the slaves. Of course, by modern standards, this is absolutely appalling, but it was quite normal and accepted at the time. And this is an open secret. It's not necessarily like Jefferson was trying to hide this. Even when it really broke nationwide when he was president, it didn't really hurt him politically at the time. And many people, of course, knew about this, so very commonly accepted. All right. Now, we must say that Jefferson did treat his slaves much better than most slave owners. Rather than using physical punishment, like he never, whoopsie, I need to get rid of that. He never ever whipped them. For example, he used rewards as a motivator. He used rewards over punishment as a motivator. But still, the dude owned people. So rather than whipping slaves or depriving them of food, for example, he would give them more food or better lodgings or better clothes if they did a good job. This comes from Jefferson's enlightened ideas. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's a little better, but still, it's not much. Now, here's the thing. He also agreed that slavery, typo folks, not war, that should say was, that slavery was wrong, but he didn't know how it should be dealt with during his time. He was really, really hoping that future generations would end it. There are many writings of Jefferson in his life saying that he knew slavery was wrong, he knew it was a sin, he knew it was bad, but his attitude is, well, that's the world we live in, it's not going to change, maybe in the future people will be more educated and enlightened and deal with it. So, kind of kicking the can down the road. Now, the fact that we have this wealthy Virginian slave owner, plantation owner, say that he knows slavery is wrong is a step, a small step in the right direction, but it's not enough. And it should be noted, he did do things to try to end slavery. Actually, in the original Declaration of Independence, he condemned slavery. But it's not in the final version of the Declaration of Independence. It got voted out in committee because obviously, Jefferson, he writes the Declaration of Independence. He's saying that slavery is wrong and the king gave it to us. He brings us to the other founding fathers in Philadelphia, and they're saying, we like what you say about freedom and all men are equal and all stuff, but don't mess with slavery, Thomas. We make a lot of money off of that. All right, so he spoke out about it, got voted down, and in fact, when all the states were making their individual state constitutions before the federal constitution, Jefferson was a part of the constitution making of Virginia, and he really did try to end slavery in the Virginia state constitution. Obviously, of course, it didn't work. Virginians made a lot of money off of slaves, right? It should also be noted that when Jefferson was a young lawyer, he defended many slaves who were suing for their freedom. And he defended these slaves for free, a term called as pro bono. So here we see, and folks, I should just say, this is a very small snippet. Okay, my wife's nodding her head. This is a very small snippet of the relationship of Thomas Jefferson and slavery, all right? There's a lot of bad, and there are some signs that he tried to fix it by trying to end slavery in the Virginia Constitution, defending slaves for free as a young lawyer, denouncing an original Declaration of Independence. This is only a couple of examples. We could spend a whole much more time, but I want you to know that the man is complicated and a walking paradox by condemning it and still benefiting greatly off of it. Okay, let's talk really quick about the Republic of Haiti. Pictured here, this is a map of Haiti. It is located near Cuba, and it shares an island with the Dominican Republic. This is Haiti right over here. Now, you got a little bit of a foreshadowing in this in a reading that you did a few weeks ago, but let's unpack this a little more. Haiti had themselves a revolution from France, and they themselves became a nice, independent republic. It should be noted that at this time, there were really technically only two republics in the world, and that was the United States and Haiti. I should also note that we're fast forwarding now. This is during the presidency of Jefferson. You could argue that France was a republic, although if you look at what was going on in France at that time and the whole Napoleon issue, not really a republic. It started out as a revolution for a republic in France, but it went south really quick. So at this time, there are two republics in the world, the United States and Haiti. However, Jefferson chose to not support the new Republic of Haiti, like I said, which became a republic after a slave revolution freed it from France. And it's important to point out this slave revolution part. Haiti was a predominantly black nation that was made up almost entirely of ex-slaves. The French owned this land. It was one of their colonies. All right, the French got rid of the natives who lived there. They imported African slaves to do all the work, and the French aristocrats looked over them, and the slaves said, "We're having enough." They have a successful slave revolution, one of the only successful slave revolutions in history. It's a huge deal, and they kick out the French, and they set up the free, independent Republic of Haiti. It is a huge moment in the anti-slavery worldwide crusade. Now, Jefferson, however, decides not to support it. Jefferson really was trying to get on the good side with France. As we know from our past discussions, Jefferson really admired France. He thought that their revolution could be saved, and this looks really bad. Like I said, Haiti was the only other republic at this time in history, and they really wanted the support of the United States because they're saying, "Hey, United States, we had a revolution from an oppressive foreign country, just like you. We set up a republic, just like you. You and me are the same." And Jefferson says, "I see your point, but diplomatically, the United States gains more from being buddy with France, right?" Jefferson supported France, who was trying to retake Haiti and enslave all the inhabitants, right? Now, this eventually wouldn't work, and Haiti to this day remains its own independent country and one of the only successful slave revolutions ever. Later on in the year, we're going to talk about slavery more in depth, and we'll talk about some very unsuccessful slave revolutions that happened in the American South. But were they really unsuccessful, even just because that they technically failed in their objective? More on that later. Okay. Last thing we're going to talk about today is something that Jefferson actually did to help end the slave trade. Keep in mind, he's a paradox. He's making money off it, he's speaking out against it. He's having slave children and ignoring them, and he's trying to end slavery, right? So we're going to talk about the act prohibiting the importation of slaves, right? Like I said, Jefferson he did a small part to move the ball forward on ending slavery. And I should note, this is during his presidency. This is while Thomas Jefferson is president. Jefferson knew he couldn't, as president, just wave his pen and outlaw slavery completely. That would have moved the Civil War up by about 55 years. Congress would have vetoed it. The Supreme Court would have vetoed it because it's technically denying slave owners their property, as slaves were considered. And property is pretty gosh darn clearly guaranteed as a protection in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And because slaves were considered property and not legally people, it wouldn't have worked. So Jefferson is looking around and he's saying, what can I do? I'm an enlightened guy. Yes, I have slaves, but I still want to do something to move the ball. So he pushes for and successfully signs into law, meaning that this did pass both houses of Congress, which is truly impressive. He signs into law the act prohibiting the importation of slaves in 1807, and it went into effect in 1808. Is this a small step toward the eventual ball of I'm getting my metaphors across. I'm going to stick with one. This is definitely one small yard in the football game. No, okay. It's one small step towards the end of slavery, folks. Okay, I should have written these metaphors out beforehand. Obviously, slavery wouldn't end years later to the 13th Amendment in 1865, but this is one small step toward it. Now, it should be noted that the reason this took place in the year 1808 remember, it went into effect in 1808, is not by happenstance. It is not random. In the OG Constitution, the year 1808 was the earliest possible time that the institution of slavery could be messed with at all. The founders put it in there. They're saying, hey, we know a lot of people don't like slavery, but we really need it, and right now we're focused on one unified country, and if we get rid of slavery, the South's going to not be a part of this country, and we need the South. So you know what? Let's just leave slavery alone till 1808. So Jefferson was fortunate enough to be president at this time and finally put his money where his rich mouth was and do something to move the ball forward on ending slavery completely. We must give him credit for that. Now, what does this act say? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory from this title. This act said that no new slaves could be imported to the United States from Africa or anywhere else. This is a huge deal. Ever since the year 1619, slaves from mostly Africa have been brought to the American colonies, which is now the United States, from many countries, including Great Britain, right? So this essentially ends this practice that had been existing in this area for over 200 years. All right, Jefferson's saying that's it. We are closing the doors. No new slaves are coming in. His logic being, if we stop importing slaves from Africa, which is just a whole human rights violation in and of itself, perhaps slavery will slowly start to die out in this country because we will not be getting any more Africans in here. Now, of course, it didn't end up working out like that, but still, this is huge. Jefferson's basically saying, no new slaves from Africa or anywhere else. If you want slaves, you have to work with what you already have in the United States at 1808. This also essentially ends the legal slave trade from Africa. Over here, this picture shows something we looked at the very start of this year called the Triangle Trade Route or the Atlantic Trade Route, where people from Europe would take their goods, textiles, brandy, and weapons, trade them with kings and strongmen in Africa, who would go into the interior of Africa, capture other African tribes, sell them to the Europeans who trade them, and those slaves would go to the New World when they'd be traded for sugar, coffee, and tobacco, which would go over here back to England, and this cycle continues. This really ends a lot of that. And again, it is a huge deal. This has been happening for over 200 years, ever since the year 1619. 1619, of course, being the year the first African slaves were brought to the colonies. Actually, later, we're going to take a listen to the new acclaimed New York Times podcast called 1619, which looks at the history of slavery in the United States. Okay. Now, however, while this is a great thing, and while Jefferson really thought he was doing a good job by moving the ball forward, his idea being like, listen, we'll cut off the faucet, we'll cut off the supply, eventually slavery will fizzle out. Not quite. So there are two negative side effects we need to look at from this act, okay? The first one is that smuggling obviously continues, because duh. If the government bans something, it doesn't go away. The government has banned many drugs, for example, and yet we still have a huge illegal drug problem in this country. Pirates at this time were still very much a thing. Even Han Solo made a lot of money smuggling spice on the Kessel Run, making it in under 12 parsecs, might I add. So here's the problem. Yes, you outlaw the slave trade, Jefferson, but smuggling of slaves from Africa did continue, and smugglers are getting extremely rich, because if you make something illegal and you go to sell it, guess what you can do? You can jack up the prices, because you as the seller are taking on a huge risk by selling this illegal product, in this case being slaves from Africa. So, did the act prohibiting the importation of slaves actually stop it? Not really. It stopped the legal open practice of it, but you still had people, entrepreneurs from America, taking boats over here, capturing Africans themselves, or working with local tribes and bringing them back here and selling them essentially on the black market. These people were getting very rich. It kind of leads to the birth of organized crime, which is just like what happened with Al Capone and the Chicago mob. during Prohibition. Little side note here, okay? Mr. Johnson's going to go off on a little rant, so you can take this time to use the bathroom if you don't care. When the United States outlawed alcohol, which is true, it did that for a couple of years, and around the 1920s. That's what essentially created the mob or the mafia in Chicago, because there was this guy, maybe you've heard of him, Al Capone, and he made it rich bootlegging, which is to say illegally producing and selling alcohol. And most organized crime can trace its roots back to this, because everyone still wanted alcohol. The government made it illegal. It did not go away. People made a lot of money selling it. So if you make something illegal, you're essentially unintentionally creating organized crime around that. Okay, side note over. One last negative side effect of this. This drives the prices of slaves who already exist in the United States up, right? So again, people made money selling slaves before, including Jefferson. But now, if no new slaves are coming in, say you might get $400 for a healthy young slave boy before this act. Well, now you might be able to get upwards of $1,000 because supply is limited. This is simple economics, folks. It's supply and demand. When the supply is limited, the demand goes up and the price goes up. And a very ugly turn of events, breeding programs really start to boom in the United States, which essentially means that slaves were bred like people breed dogs or horses today. Yes, this did exist before the act prohibiting the importation of slaves, but on a much smaller scale. Now, this is going to boom and become a cottage industry in and of itself. And a breeding program is essentially when you take a very strong, healthy male slave and a very healthy female slave who have good genes, and you basically force them to have children, lots of children, the idea being that these slaves are healthy, they're hard workers. If we breed them and make them have children together, their offspring will be good slaves, which we can sell for higher money. In the same way that if you buy like a thoroughbred dog, for example, it's very expensive, right? And of course, these children were instantly taken away from these mothers. Some of these mothers would have upwards of 10 to 15 children in these breeding programs if they survived all the childbirths. It's a truly dark and despicable chapter in American history. And unfortunately, it is a negative side effect of the act prohibiting the importation of slaves. So yes, Jefferson did do some good. He was trying to do some good by saying no more new slaves coming in. However, there were a whole lot of negative side effects, but he can only do so much. Jefferson was very proud of this act. He was even quoted as saying this. I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally, because it was passed by Congress, to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best interests of our country have long been eager to prescribe. So what is he saying here? We constitutionally ended the slave trade because it passed both houses and Jefferson signed it. And of course, the slave trade is, as he correctly pointed out, a huge violation of human rights. However, slavery did still exist in America, and there were still many negative side effects there. Okay, that's all I have for you now. There is going to be a reading, which you're going to have to do, which you can find in the email and on Teams. And I should note, this is just a small snapshot of the relationship between Jefferson and slavery. As you can see, he did a lot of bad things. He did some good things as well. It is extremely complicated, but that's Thomas Jefferson. That is our third president for you. All right, folks. Best of luck on your homework. If you have any questions on that, please don't hesitate to email me. And make sure you are studying for our Thomas Jefferson test on Thursday. It will be close note, proctored by a parent. You need to know it, so make sure you are studying, folks. I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.